When I moved back to Louisiana from Southern California in 1991, these sugarcane fields just seemed to call me. I realized that I lived in plantation country again, and it's one of the biggest tourist industries in America, plantation tourism. I would ask myself as I went on funerals with my family, who owns a funeral home in this area, where are all of the graves of the people who were formerly enslaved at the plantations in this area? And these sugarcane fields called me. Literally, one day I stood on the levee, right there, you know, maybe 500 feet from where I'm sitting now. And I turned around and I looked at this place. And I could see people standing in these sugarcane fields. I can't tell you what they were wearing. I can't tell you what they looked like. But I could see black people standing in these sugarcane fields. Little did I know, by 1994, I would open the doors of the River Road African American Museum that would be dedicated to preserving the history of the people who contributed to the economy and culture of this state, this parish, and this nation by providing free labor, working on these sugarcane plantations. Little did I know, here I am 25 years later, and right where I was looking from the levee was the Monroe Cemetery and the Monroe Plantation Quarters. And then just beyond me in that direction is where the Bruley Plantation Cemetery is, of unmarked burial grounds of close to 1,200 people. It's just amazing how time has passed so fast, and it's remarkable, even though it took 5 years for us to get Shell Oil to finally do something to garner off this area so that sugarcane farmers could no longer plant and plow and burn over the gravesite of the people who contributed so much to our parish, state, and nation.
The two rows, two families, one black and one white, but from the same familial tree, shows how conflicted things were in the South during slavery. Plantation owners owned slaves, but also had relationships with those slaves and bore families that were pretty much an open secret. Owners literally had two families on the same property, but of course, one wasn't called family.
Growing up in South Carolina, there was not a definitive point at which I remember knowing that my ancestors had enslaved people, but I did know that growing up. My great-great-great-grandfather was the governor of South Carolina when South Carolina seceded from the Union at the start of the Civil War. Another great-great-grandfather was the governor of South Carolina shortly after the Civil War. I did know that ancestors of mine had owned plantations and had enslaved people. And I did know that ancestors of mine had owned sugar plantations here in Louisiana as well. And later in life, I began to look into that more closely. And that's actually what brought me to the River Road African American Museum. My kids and I came down to meet Kathy and learn from her work at the River Road African American Museum a couple of summers ago, which was a really beautiful experience. And when we were leaving the museum, Kathy said, "Would you like to meet your two-row cousins in New Orleans?" And I didn't know that we had two-row cousins in New Orleans, but I knew exactly what she meant. And I said, yes, we would like to meet them. And when we first met our cousin Carol, she picked us up in New Orleans one afternoon. She spent the afternoon with us, took us to see her father's statue in New Orleans, showed us the home where she grew up. She met us with a lot of warmth. She was very gracious. We talked about how it was that we were connected. We talked very openly about that. We talked about segregation. And Kathy also encouraged me to call my cousin AP, who's living in Connecticut. And so I did. I called AP. Our first conversation was very warm, and we shared our stories of what we were involved in, our hopes for racial justice, how it was that we were connected. So I thought a lot about how to talk to my children about the fact that our ancestors enslaved people, what slavery meant to our country and what it means within our family. And we talked about, I shared with them that they would hear people say all too often that slavery was not that bad. I told them that it was that bad. I told them that they would hear that that's just the way that it was. I told them that it's not the way that it was, it's the way that people made it. We talked about when we learned about our two-row cousins. I shared with them how it is that we were connected, that AP's great-great-grandmother was enslaved to my great-great-great-grandfather, what that meant, that her body was not her own. That is a very painful reality. It's also very important to acknowledge that. And our experience together as a family in reaching in or reaching back to really welcome these connections, wanting to speak about them openly and honestly, has felt like part of our collective healing. And my children have been a very beautiful part of this experience. I look at them and I see a new day.
Well, growing up in New Orleans, I was born in 1936, and so my growing up years were the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. It was troublesome, but I grew up in a very secure family. I grew up in a community that was committed to improvement and to challenging racial segregation, to resistance, to education. So I had a very good childhood as long as I stayed within the confines of the people who supported me. Moving outside of that, when you were forced with all of the harsh segregation laws that existed, created issues for me and for everybody else that was living at that time. So it was a mixed bag of emotions, feelings, and rejections. Because of my father's work and his notoriety in town and his civil rights activities, I don't think that it was harder on me and my 5 sisters because of the community in which we lived. There were many, many very well-educated people who lived there who were supporting the effort of resistance and civil rights activities. Also, none of us had a whole lot of money. You know, because my father was a lawyer didn't mean he was rich. He had to make his living doing civil law practice. He was not paid for his civil rights work. So we weren't wealthy. We didn't live in a trophy home. We didn't drive a trophy car. And we lived in a working class neighborhood. But people were all very supportive, and he asked people to join in the effort to defeat racism. I met Ingrid through Kathy Hambrick. She came down to show her children the area that her family came from and to meet some of her two-row relatives who were white, and she went to the African American River Road Museum, and Kathy said, would you like to meet some of your black family members and know more about the black side of your family's ancestry? And that's how we got together, and it's been excellent. And her children, I think, you know, to discover that you have a whole life that you didn't know anything about and a whole history that nobody ever shared with you, it could be very exciting. And for some people, it could be be very disturbing. But for Ingrid and her family, it was a welcome adventure into a whole new culture. Because I was the only son, my father used to take me with a lot of trips, business trips and civil rights cases, and meeting with people all over the state for two reasons. One, because he wanted me to understand the real world that I would have to live in. And two, to keep him up, because he would be driving alone and, distances. It used to take 4 hours to almost, or 3 hours to get to Baton Rouge because you had to go around the waterways. You couldn't go over them. I used to come to Southern a lot. I used to come to Baton Rouge a lot. I never came to any of the plantations along the River Road. He never talked about his lineage. I think he knew that his ancestors were French plantation owners here, but he never talked about that. You know, everybody wants to do an Ancestry.com to see what their lineage is, how much European they are, how much South American they are, whether they're African or Native Americans. I think as people in general begin to research their ancestry, they're going to find a lot of things that they didn't know. They're going to find that they're mixed with a lot of things that some of them like or don't like. I think it's going to take people with courage and fortitude and interest in history to recognize that we're all mixed and we're all in this together, and we should celebrate whatever our ancestry is and tell the stories the way they happened. I think that it would be very important if people in Louisiana could come together as a collaborative effort to support, build, and expand a significant and comprehensive museum that tells the true story of Louisiana, that would include the history of the slaves that came here and built all of the cities and communities in Louisiana, as well as the white Europeans that came, and talk about the culture and what it is today. And I think we need a significant place like that because of the history of this area.
One of the important team members of the River Road Slave Burial Grounds Coalition is Hugh Bourgoin, plant manager of Shell Convent, where the Bruley and Monroe cemeteries are located.
Our role as in the community is very important to us. I mean, primarily we want to be a safe and reliable neighbor, and we also want to play a role to help and support the community. Areas where we are very active are in the areas of workforce development and education. We have also, as part of our values as Shell, respect for people is something that is important to us. And one example that I would use is the partnership that Shell has had over now more than 20 years with the River Road African American Museum, starting at Geismar and Convent. So this is one example, obviously, that connects to our project that I wanted to highlight. I came on site less than 2 years ago, and I found out about the cemeteries at the early part of 17, and got me the opportunity to meet with the River Road African American Museum and to educate myself about the finding, the archaeological study, and the cultural significance of the finding, and that very quickly turned into the project that we know about and that we unveiled a few weeks ago. We started this project to show our respect for the interred, and that was the preservation, the protection, and the beautification of the cemeteries. This was also the ceremony where we had about 400 people coming together for this event. Now is how do we take this further? And your question you asked about education. So the things that we are working on now is putting together some documents and documentaries and support for to enable this education mission. So we want to be able to have something that we can take to interested parties and schools and be able to share the meaning of what we did. Some of the details we need to work that with the museum, but I think our intention is absolutely to leverage the education component of this project.
Dr. Thomas Durant is a longtime board member of the River Road African American Museum, as well as retired professor of history at LSU and author of 3 books. He is also a member of the River Road Slave Burial Grounds Coalition.
Since I've been involved with the River Road African American Museum for the past 20 years, I think to me this is one of the most important social and cultural institutions in this community that has been developed maybe in the last half century or so. And I say that because before the River Road African American Museum was established, there were few, if any, institutions that preserved and educated people on the history and the culture of African American people, particularly in South Louisiana. So what the River Road African American did was to become a firm institution in South Louisiana to conduct research and to educate people about the history and the culture of African American people who lived in this area. I really believe that because that the River Road African American Museum was really the impetus for Shell to really make the discovery that it did. Because I think we all knew that there were slave cemeteries along the River Road. I think that Shell Oil Company knew that there were slave cemeteries. All they had to do was just to authenticate that through archaeological research. But you know, we already knew that there were slave cemeteries. We just had to locate them and find them. And I think the fact that the Shell Oil Company decided, with our encouragement, of course, and sometimes a little bit of protest, if you will, that they would make this discovery. And what it means is that for the first time in my recollection, a major industrial company, I may say an industrial giant, is now recognizing the dignity and the humanity of the people who were enslaved on these plantations. In order to be made whole, you have to recognize 3 dimensions of your existence: the past, the present, and the future. Now, we can be made whole by knowing the truth of our history and what happened to us in the past, and that's why we researching and educating people about the history, because if you don't know where you came from, you can't know where you're going. So in order to be made whole, we first have to know our history as a people. And when I said know it, I don't mean just a casual knowledge of it. We have to know it to the point that it becomes ingrained in our spirit and we can tell people about it. We have to be able to get our youth to become involved in the full development of our communities, our families, our schools, our communities in general. And I think the beneficiaries of this would be not only the black community, but America as a whole, because America cannot be as great as it can be until everybody in America is as great as they can be. And that includes the African American community as well.
The brother and sister team of Kathy and Daryl Hambrick were co-founders of the River Road African American Museum. It was Kathy who also helped found and coordinate the River Road Slave Burial Grounds Coalition. After working with archaeologist Dave Port, who was hired by Shell to study the burial sites, Dave did some of his research and helped source names of the formerly enslaved at the River Road African American Museum with the help of Kathy.
As a funeral director and a licensed funeral director with the state of Louisiana, it's just unearthing that people would actually bury someone without identifying who they were, and even putting their time of birth and time of death on some kind of marker. I mean, if we look back to the pyramids of Egypt, we see markings, and this is hundreds and thousands of years ago, or should I say a long time, longer than 100 years ago, and these graves are still identified and marked. And here you have people who have been buried within the last 200 years in a cemetery when we had the ability to do it, but we just did not have the concern for those people who were actually buried in those cemeteries. How you bury your dead says a lot about the civilization at that time, and to find graves of this multitude without any markings says a lot about the people who were a part of those times. Anywhere else you would find that there would be markings. Even the Native Americans had Indian mounds that separated the land from other land, so people would identify it as a burial space. Here you have graves of enslaved people who have worked their entire lives to provide an economic support for a community that they receive very little credit, even in death.
When I started this museum 25 years ago, I didn't think that there were going to be this many challenges. Here we are now 24 years later after the museum opened at the Texcoco plantation, and we're in Donaldsonville, and we're still able to share the names with the thousands of visitors that come from around the world, names of people who were enslaved in this region of sugarcane country in South Louisiana. This museum, part of our mission at this museum is to preserve, collect, and interpret the history as it is related to the heritage of Africans and African Americans in South Louisiana along the Mississippi River. The names that you see on the wall behind me are just a few of the names related to the Homus plantation, which was owned at one time by the Toureau and the Branger family. As I started to do research when I first opened the museum, I noticed that this map that you see here to my left was in many of the doctor's offices and lawyer offices around the greater Baton Rouge area and the rural areas along the river. Little did I know that this 1858 map of sugarcane country reveals to us the names of the plantations and the names of the owners of the plantations. Ascension Parish alone, which is in this area of the map here, had 100 plantations since the late 1700s. And if you think about it, if one plantation had 753 enslaved people, and there were 100 plantations in one parish, how many people could possibly be buried along the Mississippi River Road on the properties that are now inhabited by the industry, mostly the petrochemical industry in this area? The names on this wall represent families, people that I went to high school with, people that I went to church with, who I still go to church with, and this museum serves as a genealogical resource center for those people who are searching for their roots. When Shell Oil hired the archaeological firm, one of the archaeologists came to me and was very interested in the names that you see here on the wall from the Homus House Burnside Cemetery. He shared with me that they had found one headstone with M.K. Mitchell on that headstone. And I immediately could turn to this wall and point out to him the Mitchell name on several of these panels. which date 1858, which is the same time frame as this map, known as the PERSAP map of 1858. The most astonishing thing about doing this work at the River Road African American Museum is seeing these names. Most of the time when you see names of enslaved people, there are only first names, as you can see at the top of the panel here to my right. Most enslaved people, their names were changed from their original African names, and they were given American names. If they had a French plantation owner, they got French names. If they had a Spanish plantation owner, they got Spanish names. So if you only have a first name, as you might see the name Mary or Sally or Sarah or Bob or Yellow Jim or Black Nancy, in some of these references of the enslaved people, how in the world would you ever know if one of those persons was your great-great-great-grandmother or your great-great-great-grandfather? So we are able to tell people, show people where the former plantations were, and also share with them the census records here at the museum. And we also have a collection of family reunion books that have been shared with us over 25 years of people from around the country who come back here to have family reunions. Finally, after 5 years of being notified by the archaeologists that they found a headstone in this Monroe cemetery with M.K. Mitchell's name on it, it's taken 5 years, but thanks to the coalition that I founded in 2013, the River Road African Burial Grounds Coalition, we were able to get Shell to finally cease the lease with the sugarcane farmers to protect this site. We're hoping that through legislation and the formation of a commission with the state of Louisiana, that one day there will be congressional legislation in the same way that the Native American burial grounds are protected. We are hoping that all of the unmarked burial grounds and long-lost cemeteries of Africans and African Americans along this Mississippi River corridor will be protected.
The River Road African American Museum needs your support so we can continue to do some of the great work we do to educate, uplift, and empower about the African American experience in America from an African American narrative. Call for more information, and better still, come to the museum or visit our website and learn more about how you can get involved to help us bridge partnerships with the business community, provide support for the mission of the museum, and enjoy the educational journey about the fascinating history of the African American in Louisiana and the United States of America.